In the distant future, humanity had expanded far beyond Earth, reaching the farthest corners of the galaxy. A new era of exploration had begun, but it was also one filled with conflict. The war between humanity and the alien empire known as the Zalorian Dominion had raged for years. It was a war that had taken a toll on both sides, leaving entire worlds in ruin. The battles were relentless, the stakes high, and the cost unimaginable. Among the chaos, one story stood out, a story of a young alien princess, a lost daughter, and the man who would risk everything to bring her home. Captain Nathaniel "Nate" Williams was a soldier in the human Space Force, a special forces officer known for his bravery and unyielding determination. He was the kind of man who never backed down from a fight, no matter how dangerous. His reputation had earned him the trust of his commanders, and when the mission to rescue Princess Sarath of the Zalorian Dominion was given to him, he did not hesitate. The princess had been taken captive years ago during a surprise attack on her home planet, Solaris. It was an attack that had caught the Zalorians off guard and shattered their once impenetrable defenses. The princess, only a child at the time, had been captured by a rogue faction of the Zalorian Dominion, those who sought to use her as a pawn in their own fight for power. Since that day, her mother, Queen Scylla, had searched tirelessly for her lost daughter, but no one had ever found her. For years, the galaxy had been filled with rumors about the princess's fate, whispers that she was still alive, but hidden away in some forgotten corner of the universe. These rumors reached Earth's top military leaders, and they saw an opportunity. If the princess could be found, she could be the key to ending the war. She was not just the daughter of a queen. She was a symbol of hope, a beacon of peace in the darkness of war. If humanity could reunite her with her mother, it might be the first step toward ending the conflict. Nate's team was tasked with finding her, but the mission was not an easy one. The Zalorian Dominion controlled vast swaths of space, and their influence was everywhere. They had advanced technology, powerful fleets, and a network of spies that stretched across the galaxy. To make matters worse, Nate and his team had only the vaguest of leads, an old transmission intercepted by human intelligence that hinted at a hidden location on the edge of Zalorian space. The location was a forgotten mining facility, one that had long been abandoned by the Dominion, but was rumored to hold the key to the princess's whereabouts. Nate's team, a group of elite soldiers trained for the most dangerous missions, prepared for the operation. They knew the risks. They were about to venture deep into enemy territory with no guarantee of success. They would have to rely on their wits, their training, and each other to succeed. If they failed, they would be lost, and the war would continue, costing more lives on both sides. As the team boarded their ship, the Orion's Fury, Nate felt the weight of the mission settling on his shoulders. He had been on many dangerous assignments before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about completing the mission. It was about saving a life, reuniting a mother with her daughter, and possibly changing the course of the war. The Orion's Fury took off, cutting through the stars with precision and speed. The crew was silent, focused on the task ahead. Nate stood in the command center, watching the stars streak by on the view screen. His mind wandered back to his own family, to the people he had lost along the way. He couldn't help but think of the young princess, alone in the dark, separated from her mother. He knew the pain of losing someone close, and the thought of reuniting a mother and daughter made the mission even more personal. The journey to the edge of Zalorian space was long, and the closer they got, the more tense the atmosphere became. Nate and his team spent hours reviewing their intel, strategizing their approach, and preparing for any potential confrontation. They knew that once they arrived at the mining facility, they would be walking into a dangerous situation. The rogue faction that had captured the princess was known for its ruthlessness, and they would stop at nothing to keep her hidden. Finally, after days of travel, the Orion's Fury arrived at its destination, the abandoned mining facility on the planet Vandar. The facility, once a thriving operation, now stood in eerie silence. Its vast machinery, once humming with life, was now still, covered in dust and rust. The planet was uninhabited, its surface scarred by years of mining and neglect. But somewhere within the decaying walls of the facility, Princess Sarath was waiting. Nate's heart raced as the team prepared to land. They donned their combat gear and checked their weapons one last time. There was no turning back now. They were about to enter enemy territory, and every second counted. As the Orion's fury touched down on the desolate surface, the team deployed, moving swiftly through the darkened landscape toward the facility. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the crunch of their boots on the dry earth. The facility loomed ahead, its massive doors sealed shut, but Nate and his team knew where to go. They had studied every piece of intel, and they had identified a weak spot in the facility's defenses. With a quick motion, Nate activated the breach charge, and the heavy doors of the facility groaned open, revealing the dark interior. The team moved in, guns raised, every sense on high alert. The air inside was cold and stale, the smell of rust and old machinery filling their lungs. They moved cautiously through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. After what felt like hours of searching, they found her. Princess Serath was locked in a small, windowless room at the heart of the facility. She was lying on a cot, her body thin from lack of food, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up as they entered, her expression a mix of hope and terror. She had been held captive for so long that she hardly recognized the soldiers in front of her. Nate stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Princess Serath, we're here to take you home. We're here to bring you back to your mother." For a moment, the princess didn't respond. She simply stared at him as though trying to comprehend that someone had finally come for her. Then, slowly, she nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Nate extended a hand to her, offering her the freedom she had longed for. The princess hesitated for a moment, but then she took his hand, her grip trembling. She was weak, but the warmth of human compassion was enough to break through the fear that had held her captive all these years. "We're getting you out of here," Nate assured her, his voice gentle. "You're going home." The team worked quickly to escort the princess out of the facility. They moved through the corridors with urgency, knowing that time was running out. The rogue faction would not let them escape without a fight, and the longer they stayed in the facility, the more dangerous the situation became. As they reached the ship, Nate could hear the distant sound of engines powering up, signaling that they were not alone. The rogue faction had arrived. The Orion's fury lifted off just as the enemy forces began to close in. The battle for the princess was far from over, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Nate looked over at Princess Serath, who sat quietly by his side. She had been through so much, and the road ahead would be just as dangerous, but for now, she was safe. The galaxy had just begun to change, and it all started with the rescue of one lost daughter. The Orion's fury cut through the stars with urgency as the ship broke free from the gravitational pull of the dead planet. The hum of the engines was the only sound in the cockpit, broken only by the occasional crackle of communication. Captain Nate Williams stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the viewscreen ahead. The rescue mission had gone as smoothly as could be expected, but the real danger was just beginning. The rogue faction of the Zalorian Dominion would not let the princess go easily, and they certainly wouldn't let a human soldier walk away with her without a fight. Behind him, Princess Serath sat quietly in a seat, her eyes focused on the floor. She looked fragile, as if the weight of the years spent in captivity had stolen much of her strength. Her once vibrant features had paled, her dark eyes wide and lost, as though she were unsure of what was real anymore. She had been in this situation for so long, surrounded by enemies, that trusting anyone seemed impossible. Nate could see the conflict in her eyes, but he knew she didn't trust him yet. She had to be scared after everything she had endured. He didn't blame her. If anything, he felt a deep sympathy for her. He had seen the horrors of war, but he could never imagine what it was like to lose everything. Your home, your people, your family, and end up alone in a strange place, held hostage by those who would use you as a pawn in their games of power. The princess hadn't spoken much during the journey, and Nate didn't press her. He understood the importance of silence in moments like these. Some things couldn't be rushed, and some wounds took time to heal. For now, he simply watched over her, ensuring that she felt as safe as possible in the midst of this chaotic situation. It was only when the ship passed through the Zalorian blockade, with its countless ships guarding the outer perimeter of their territory, that the danger truly became apparent. The rogue faction had intercepted their transmission, and it didn't take long for their ships to close in on the Orion's fury. Nate's calm demeanor remained intact, but inside, his mind raced with calculations. They would be able to outrun some of the ships, but the larger ones with their more advanced weapons were another matter. The next few minutes would be critical. "Captain," Lieutenant Arden's voice crackled through the comms. "We've got incoming fire." Two ships closing fast, more on the way. Nate's heart quickened, but his voice remained steady. "All hands to battle stations. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." The sound of feet rushing down the corridors echoed through the ship as crew members scrambled to their positions. Nate took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had been in battles before, plenty of them, but there was something different about this one. He was no longer just fighting for victory or survival. He was fighting for the safety of a young princess who had just begun to taste freedom again. The first blast shook the ship, rattling everything in the cockpit. Sparks flew from the control panel, and the ship lurched violently. Nate gripped the controls tightly, steering the ship into a sharp dive to avoid the incoming barrage of fire. Behind him, Sereth gasped, her hands gripping the armrests of her seat as if trying to anchor herself to something solid. Nate didn't dare look back. He had to focus. Another blast hit, and the ship shuddered once more. The shields were holding for now, but Nate knew they wouldn't last long against this kind of attack. He needed to get them out of this mess, and fast. The stars outside became a blur as he engaged the ship's afterburners, sending them into a high-speed descent toward the nearest asteroid field. "Hold on," Nate shouted over his shoulder. "This is going to get rough." The asteroid field was their best chance. The larger Zalorian ships were too slow to navigate through the dense field of rocks and debris, and Nate hoped that the Orion's Fury could use its agility to its advantage. He pulled the ship into a series of sharp turns, weaving through massive asteroids that threatened to tear the ship apart if they collided. Every maneuver was calculated, every turn measured, as he fought to keep the ship on course and avoid the pursuing enemy vessels. Behind him, Sereth's eyes were wide with fear, her grip still tight on the seat. Nate could see the terror in her face, but he knew she would be strong. She had survived so much already. This was just one more test, one more obstacle to overcome. He could hear the enemy ships gaining ground. They were closing in, and soon they would have him in their sights. He had to make a choice. "Arden, prepare the rear cannons," Nate barked. "We're going to have to make a stand." Lieutenant Arden's voice crackled back. "Aye, Captain." "Ready on your mark." Nate gritted his teeth. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to put the princess in any more danger than she already was, but there was no choice. He couldn't outrun them forever, and there was no way the Orion's Fury would survive a direct confrontation without a fight. He only hoped that they could buy enough time for the princess to escape, for her to be reunited with her mother, the Zalorian queen. The enemy ships fired again, this time landing several hits on the Orion's Fury. The ship groaned under the strain, and Nate's heart skipped a beat when the warning lights flashed across the console. Shields were failing. "Captain," Arden's voice came through again, more urgent this time. "They're about to hit us with everything they've got. We need to get out of here." "Now," Nate shouted. "Evasive maneuvers again, get us back to that asteroid field." Nate's hands flew over the controls, pushing the ship to its limits as he pulled off one last desperate turn. The ship lurched as another blast struck the hull, but this time, Nate wasn't focusing on the immediate danger. He was already planning their next move. "Arden," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around him, "take the shot." The rear cannons on the Orion's Fury fired, their powerful blasts streaking through the darkness of space. One of the pursuing ships exploded in a burst of fiery debris. The shockwave sent the remaining enemy ship into a sharp spin, forcing it off course. Nate didn't wait to see if it was destroyed. He needed to take advantage of the momentary distraction and get them out of range. "Head for the outer rim," Nate said. "We need to lose them before they regroup." For the next several minutes, the Orion's Fury shot through the asteroid field, weaving in and out of the massive floating rocks. Nate's hands were a blur on the controls as he pulled off impossible maneuvers, hoping that their enemies would be too slow to keep up. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with every decision, every twist of the ship. The adrenaline coursed through his veins, but he kept his focus. There was no room for mistakes. After what felt like an eternity, the enemy ships finally gave up the chase. Their sensors had lost track of the Orion's Fury, and they were no longer able to follow. Nate slowed the ship down, his breath heavy as the adrenaline began to wear off. He allowed himself a moment to relax to catch his breath. Behind him, Princess Serath's voice was barely a whisper. "Are we safe now?" Nate glanced back at her, meeting her gaze for the first time since the battle. She looked different now, less terrified, less uncertain. For the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. He nodded, his voice soft but sure. "We're safe, for now." The princess's shoulders sagged with relief, but she still didn't speak. Nate could tell that the gravity of the situation hadn't fully sunk in for her. She had been through so much, and it would take time for her to process everything that had happened. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They had survived, and they would keep going. Nate turned his attention back to the controls, the long journey ahead weighing on his mind. He knew the risks they still faced. The princess's enemies were out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had her back. But as long as he drew breath, he would keep her safe. That was the promise he had made when he took on this mission, and he intended to keep it. "Get some rest, princess," he said quietly. "We've got a long road ahead of us." As he spoke, he realized that, in this moment, the human soldier and the alien princess were no longer so different. They were both survivors, both fighting for a future that seemed far too uncertain. But together, they might just have a chance. The journey through the vast expanse of space was never easy, but as the days passed, Captain Nate Williams felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The mission was far from over. They had rescued Princess Serath from the mining facility, but that was only the beginning. The rogue faction that had taken her captive wasn't the only threat they had to worry about. There were still the remnants of the Zalorian Dominion, still intent on using her as a pawn in their political games. Nate couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. The princess's safety was paramount, and the road ahead would be fraught with danger. The Orion's fury hummed steadily through the darkness of space as it made its way toward a hidden safe house on the outskirts of Zalorian territory. It wasn't much, but it was their best shot at finding refuge. The ship's interior was dimly lit, the soft glow of control panels illuminating the faces of those aboard. The crew had settled into a tense quiet, each of them focused on the task at hand. It was clear that they had all been through a lot, and no one was willing to let their guard down just yet. Princess Serath, who had remained silent throughout most of the journey, sat alone in one of the small lounges, staring out of the window at the stars. She hadn't spoken much since they left Vandar, and Nate could sense her unease. She had been through so much, captured by enemies, trapped in a cold and dark facility, and now torn away from the only world she had known. The pain of it all was evident in her eyes. She was a princess, a daughter of a queen, yet she seemed like a young girl lost in a world that had changed beyond her understanding. Nate couldn't help but feel a deep sense of compassion for her. He knew what it was like to feel lost, to feel like everything had been taken from you. He had been in battles, had fought for causes he believed in, but never had he felt the weight of such a personal mission. This wasn't just about the war anymore. It was about one life, one person, and the hope that they could help her find a sense of peace again. He stood in the doorway of the lounge for a moment, watching her. His instinct was to speak, to reassure her, but he hesitated. Words often felt inadequate in moments like this. The best thing he could do was to give her the space she needed, while still being there for her if she decided to speak. After a long pause, Serath turned her head slightly and met his gaze. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else in them now, something that wasn't there before, a glimmer of hope, of trust. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. Nate gave her a small smile and nodded. "You don't need to thank me. We're in this together now." Serath's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she looked out at the stars again. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken bond that had been forged through their shared ordeal. She was no longer just a princess to him, she was a person, a survivor just like him. The silence stretched on, comfortable yet heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Nate had no illusions. The road to safety would not be easy. The Zalorian Dominion, even in its fractured state, would stop at nothing to get their hands on the princess. She was more than just a symbol to them. She was the key to their power, their claim to the throne, and they would do anything to make sure she didn't fall into the hands of their enemies. Nate had been trained to fight, to survive, to protect, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. He wasn't just fighting for a cause anymore, he was fighting for Serath's future. The future of a girl who had been thrust into a position of power she never asked for. A girl who had been torn away from everything she knew, forced to endure the worst that the universe had to offer. And now he was her only hope. He couldn't fail her. He wouldn't fail her. The ship continued on its course, moving slowly but steadily through the depths of space. It was hard to shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger was lurking just beyond the reach of their sensors. The Zalorians were relentless. They had technology beyond anything humanity had seen, and their fleet was still one of the most powerful in the galaxy. But the Orion's Fury was a fast ship, agile and capable of outmaneuvering most of their pursuers. Nate's crew was highly trained, and he had every confidence in them. But there was always that nagging feeling at the back of his mind, the feeling that no matter how prepared they were, it might not be enough. As they approached the safe house, the tension on the ship seemed to grow. Nate and his crew knew that they had to be prepared for anything. The safe house was hidden in a remote part of space, far from any major colonies or inhabited planets, but that didn't mean they would be safe. The area was still within the reach of Zalorian patrols, and it was possible that they would be discovered before they could make it there. "Nate," Arden's voice came through the comms, breaking his concentration. "We've got a problem." Nate's pulse quickened. "What's going on?" "We've detected multiple ships moving in our direction. They're not Zalorian patrols, but they're not friendly either. They've got the kind of firepower that could take us out if we don't act fast." Nate's mind raced. "What's the ship count?" "5 ships, Captain," Arden replied. "They've got us outgunned, but they're still too far out to be able to target us. If we move fast enough, we might be able to avoid a direct confrontation." Nate's hands moved over the controls, his mind quickly running through options. He needed to think fast. If these ships weren't Zalorian, then they were most likely mercenaries or rogue factions, groups with a reputation for being ruthless. They weren't here for a peaceful negotiation. They were here for one thing, to capture or kill. "We need to stay ahead of them," Nate said. "Get us to that safe house, Arden, now." The ship's engines roared as they accelerated, pushing the Orion's Fury to its limits. The stars outside the window blurred as they raced through space, the distant ship still gaining on them. It was a race against time now. The safe house was only a few minutes away, but those few minutes felt like an eternity. Arden's voice came back over the comms, urgency in every word. "We've got incoming fire, Captain. They're closing in." The ship rocked as the first shot hit, the sound of impact vibrating through the hull. Nate gripped the controls tighter, his focus unbroken. He wasn't about to let this ship, his team, be taken down by a few rogue ships. They had too much to fight for. "Return fire," Nate ordered, his voice calm but firm. "We're not going down without a fight." Arden immediately fired back, the rear cannons sending powerful blasts toward their pursuers. The Orion's Fury dipped and weaved, evading most of the incoming fire as Nate skillfully maneuvered the ship through the expanse of space. The battle was fierce, the sound of explosions filling the ship as they fought off their attackers. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the pursuing ships pulled back. The sensors showed them veering off, their weapons deactivated, retreating into the void of space. Nate let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, glancing at the crew with a sense of relief. "We've lost them," Arden reported, "but we need to stay sharp. We're not in the clear yet." Nate nodded, but his eyes turned to Sarath. She had witnessed everything, and the fear was still evident in her eyes. But there was something else, too, a flicker of resolve, as though she was starting to understand what it meant to survive, to fight for something greater than oneself. "We're almost there," Nate said softly. "We've made it this far, and we're going to get you to safety." "I promise." The ship pushed on toward the safe house, and as they neared their destination, the crew knew the journey was far from over. There were more battles ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But for now, at least for a brief moment, they had won. And for Sarath, that was enough. The journey had been long, and the battles many. But as the Orion's Fury made its final approach to the hidden safe house, Captain Nate Williams couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of their mission was yet to come. The ship's engines hummed steadily as the crew went about their duties, preparing for their arrival at the hidden base. The air inside the ship was thick with tension, but there was also a sense of quiet determination. They had made it this far despite the odds. They had saved Princess Sarath, evaded enemy ships, and survived one battle after another. But now they were entering a new phase of their mission, one where there would be no room for mistakes. Princess Sarath sat quietly in the ship's lounge, her hands folded in her lap. She had grown quieter over the past few days. The strain of her captivity, combined with the uncertainty of their journey, weighed heavily on her. Nate had noticed how she had withdrawn into herself, her eyes distant as she gazed out the window at the stars. He knew that the physical dangers were not the only ones she faced. The mental and emotional toll of being thrust into a war, of losing everything she had ever known, was just as overwhelming. Nate had seen it before: soldiers, survivors, anyone who had been pushed to their limits by war and loss. They all carried a weight. Some wore it on their sleeves, others buried it deep inside. But it was always there, quietly affecting every decision, every action. As the Orion's fury neared the safe house, the crew's nerves were on edge. They had been briefed about the location: a remote outpost located on a barren, uninhabited moon in the outer reaches of Zalorian space. It was a place that had been used by resistance groups during the earlier days of the war, a place where fugitives could hide from the watchful eyes of the Zalorian military. The safe house was small, isolated, and difficult to find, but that also made it a perfect place for the princess to hide for the time being. The goal was simple: keep her safe, protect her from those who would use her for their own gain, and wait for the right time to strike back at the Dominion. But as the ship descended through the atmosphere of the moon, Nate couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. There was a gnawing sensation in the pit of his stomach, a sense that their arrival wouldn't be as smooth as they hoped. He wasn't a superstitious man, but he had learned to trust his instincts after all these years in combat. Something told him that they weren't going to find the sanctuary they had expected. "Captain," Lieutenant Arden's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're approaching the landing site. No sign of enemy ships, but we should stay alert." "There's no telling what's waiting for us down there," Nate nodded. "Keep your eyes on the scanners. If anything moves, let me know immediately." The Orion's fury descended slowly, its engines roaring as it cut through the atmosphere. The moon below was rocky and desolate, with nothing but craggy terrain stretching as far as the eye could see. There was no sign of life, no sign of any activity. It was as empty as a ghost town, and that made Nate even more uneasy. He knew that silence often meant danger in places like this. The ship touched down with a soft thud, the landing gear settling onto the rocky surface. Nate's hands gripped the controls as the ship's engines powered down, the hum of the ship slowly fading away. He stood up and moved toward the door, gesturing for his team to follow. "Let's move out," Nate said, his voice steady, though his mind raced with questions. "Stay sharp. This isn't over." The air outside the ship was cold, thin, and dry. The surface of the moon was barren, dotted with sharp rocks and jagged cliffs. There was no life here, no vegetation, no animals, just the stark emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. The crew moved swiftly, their boots crunching against the dust as they made their way toward the entrance of the safe house, a small structure half buried in the rocky ground. Sarath, though still quiet, walked beside Nate, her gaze fixed on the ground ahead of her. She looked different now, more like the young princess she truly was, no longer just a symbol of the war. She had been through so much, and yet there was still a flicker of strength in her. She had survived the horrors of captivity, and now she was free. But freedom, Nate knew, was a fragile thing. It wasn't enough to just be free. You had to fight for it, hold on to it, protect it at all costs. As they approached the entrance, Arden's voice crackled over the comms again. "Captain, we've got movement." "It's coming from the far side of the base." Nate's heart skipped a beat. "How many?" "Hard to tell," Arden replied, "but it looks like more than one. They're not firing yet, but we should assume they're hostile." Nate's eyes narrowed. "Get inside now." The team moved faster, their pace quickening as they reached the entrance of the safe house. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and they quickly filed inside. The interior was cold and dimly lit, the walls lined with old equipment and crates that had been abandoned years ago. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, for now that was all they needed. "Sarath," Nate said, turning to the princess, "stay here, don't move unless I say so." She nodded, though her face was filled with uncertainty. Nate could tell she was afraid, but he could also see that she was trying to hold it together. She had to be strong now. She had no other choice. The rest of the team fanned out, securing the building. Arden moved to one of the windows, scanning the area outside with his rifle in hand. "We've got a few figures moving on the ridge," he reported. "They're too far to make a clear shot, but they're heading this way." Nate's mind raced. "It's a trap," he muttered under his breath. "We've walked right into it." Just then, the building's sensors lit up, warning them of incoming fire. The sound of blaster shots echoed through the walls as explosions rocked the safe house. The force of the blast shook the ground beneath their feet and dust fell from the ceiling. The lights flickered, but the team was already moving. "Take cover," Nate shouted. They dove behind crates and pillars as the blaster fire intensified, filling the room with the sharp, crackling sounds of energy blasts. It was chaos. They had been ambushed, and there was no way to escape now. The safe house, their supposed refuge, had become their battlefield. Nate pulled out his sidearm and aimed at the entrance, his fingers tight on the trigger. "Arden, cover the rear. The rest of you stay low and stay alive." He could see the silhouettes of their attackers now, figures in dark armor, their faces hidden behind helmets. They were moving swiftly, taking cover and firing with deadly precision. But Nate's team was well trained, and they weren't going to let these mercenaries win. The battle was on. Sarath remained inside, huddled behind a large crate, trying to stay out of the line of fire. She was scared, Nate could see that, but she wasn't frozen with fear. She was watching, waiting for the right moment. There was something about her, something that made Nate believe that, despite everything, she had the strength to survive. She had been through too much not to. The gunfire continued as Nate and his team fought back, exchanging shots with their attackers. The safe house was quickly turning into a war zone, but despite the odds, Nate knew one thing: they couldn't give up. They couldn't let the princess fall back into enemy hands. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The gunfire began to slow, the attackers retreating. The team had managed to push them back, but Nate knew this wasn't over. The mercenaries would be back, and they would come with reinforcements. The battle for Sarath's safety was far from finished. As the dust settled, Nate surveyed the damage. The safe house was still standing, but barely. The walls were scorched, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt metal. Nate looked around at his team, nodding in approval. They had held their ground. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice firm. "We're good, Captain," Arden replied. "No casualties on our side, but we're not safe yet." Nate turned to Sarath, who had emerged from her hiding place. She was pale, her face drawn, but there was a determination in her eyes. She had survived the attack, and in that moment Nate realized something. She wasn't just a princess, she was a survivor. "We need to move," Nate said, turning to his team. "We can't stay here." "They'll be back with more." Sarath looked up at him, her voice steady. "Where will we go now?" Nate glanced out the window, his gaze distant. "Wherever we have to, but I promise you we'll get you to safety." The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Nate felt like there was hope. They had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now.